Welcome to Dungeon Academics. My name is Thomas and I will be your instructor. In a previous video I put up, I was talking about my plan to remake the Dungeons and Dragons weapon table and then assign a new set of weapon mastery abilities for all the weapons. So the first thing I wanted to do was build my own version of the Dungeons and Dragons weapon table. Now I've done that so far for melee weapons, I haven't done it for ranged yet, but there is a hidden algorithm in the Dungeons and Dragons weapons that works for almost every regular weapon with only one exception, which I'll get to. And by understanding how this algorithm works, I have somewhat filled in some missing gaps and perhaps added a few extra weapons to the table that I felt were missing. So what is this algorithm? Okay, the damage for weapons is based on a number of properties that each weapon has. Weapons start with a basic D6 damage. They go down one step if they're light, they go up one step if they're heavy, and as a general rule, heavy weapons are really only two-handed weapons. I've put a couple of exceptions in, we'll get to that later. In addition, they go up one step if the weapon is a martial weapon, and they have the option to be versatile, which counts as one-handed, but you get the two-handed damage if you use it two-handed. And finally, you go down one step if it's a reach weapon. Simple weapons are limited in the properties that they can have. They can have light, heavy, finesse, two-handed, versatile. No, not reach though. There are no reach simple weapons. And as a general rule, light weapons are only one-handed weapons and heavy weapons are only two-handed weapons. Okay, are there any exceptions to this? Well, there are a number of special weapons, like the lance, for example, that has its own set of rules. The lance does a D12 damage dice despite not being two-handed, unless you're on foot, and still being a reach weapon, but you get disadvantage if the target's within 5 feet. So it has its own set of rules. It doesn't follow the algorithm. The only weapon that breaks this algorithm is the trident, and I've seen a lot of other homebrew creators fix this by changing the trident's weapon. The trident is a martial weapon. It should have a base damage of D8, and it's versatile, so it should be D8, D10. It's not a light weapon, it's not a reach weapon, it's not a heavy weapon, so nothing is changing that. But in the book, it's given D6 or D8 damage. I think it should be D8, D10. It doesn't really have many special rules to change this. There are rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide for fighting underwater, which the trident's rather good at. But I don't think that's enough to drop it down a whole damage level. Okay, so I rebuilt the entire weapon table from scratch. And I did it in a spreadsheet, and I built in an algorithm that automatically calculated the damage dice. I didn't need to, it's easy enough to do by hand, but of course this is something that I want to do. The only difficulty was for versatile weapons, because I wanted to show the two damage types, or the two damage dice as a default. So I had to learn a little bit of extra spreadsheet language, and I came across a wonderful function called text join. This is in Google Sheets. The text join function allows you to basically have two outputs in the same cell. So what I do is I make an if statement, and if the weapon is not versatile, I just calculate the damage as normal. And if the weapon is versatile, I say calculate the damage as normal, then put a slash in, and then add one and mention the next damage dice. And that seems to work really well. It's calculated everything automatically. The only thing it hasn't done is the greatsword, because the greatsword slightly breaks the pattern. Instead of being a D12 damage, it's 2d6. And because this is just one exception, I just put that in manually. I think that's okay. So, did I make any new weapons? Yes, I have. I've included all the basic ones, and I've tried to fill in the set. So in most cases, you could have, okay, this is a one-handed weapon, it's a light weapon, it's a finesse weapon. Let's do bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing versions for that. There are a few exceptions there, but in situations for martial weapons where you've got things like the glaive and the halberd, which are both heavy reach two-handed weapons, they're both slashing. There isn't a bludgeoning or piercing equivalent. So I've tried to fill in gaps where possible. There are still some gaps, and perhaps that's for the best, but let's see what I've got so far. I added a weapon called a falx. A falx is a largish weapon, often with quite a long handle and then a forward curving blade. It's associated with the Dacian people who fought against Rome quite a lot, and they used this falx to great effects because when they swung it, the forward curving blade would still go over the Roman shield and hit them in the helmet. Very nasty weapon. I've added that as a simple weapon. It's a versatile slashing weapon. So D6, D8, simple weapon. It's not a particularly complicated weapon to use. There's only one thing you do with it, so it's fine that it's simple. But it fills in that gap because there's already the quarterstaff and spear, which are versatile, simple weapons for bludgeoning and piercing, but now there's a slashing one as well. And one other thing I've mentioned, for all the weapons, I've specified whether it counts as a polearm for the purposes of Polearm Master, rather than have the feat list exhaustively, these are the only weapons it applies to. I think it's better to have that in the weapon table and say, this is what counts as a polearm. It's not all going to be reach weapons, obviously, but there we go. I added the partisan. Partisan is a fairly primitive polearm weapon. It's a piercing weapon, so that's a two-handed piercing weapon. That's a simple weapon. So D8 damage, piercing, counts as a polearm. Not reach because they're not normally on a very long handle. It's essentially a slightly heavier spear, and it's why would you ever take a partisan over a spear? Because a spear is versatile, so you can still use it one-handed, and it's a thrown weapon. I don't know. I put it in there because it fills a gap. I added the scythe as a slashing simple weapon, two-handed simple weapon. People have been taking agricultural equipment to battle for millennia, so putting a scythe in allows us to have a two-handed simple slashing weapon. Nice and easy. I also added, okay, that's it for adding to simple weapons. I'm literally checking the spreadsheet as I type this. This is what I'm looking down. I'm typing this as I record this. That's okay. Moving on to martial weapons. The short sword and the scimitar offered one-handed light piercing and slashing weapons. I also wanted to add in a one-handed light bludgeoning weapon, so I've gone for the tonfa. The tonfa is roughly the same as an American police nightstick, so it's a club with a handle at 90 degrees, and I've made that a finesse weapon, light, bludgeoning. So you've now got all three damage types for light, martial, one-handed weapons. Easy peasy. Moving up to just one-handed weapons that are not light, you've got the Morning Star, the War Pick, and the Rapier. They exist. They're piercing. They are all piercing weapons. There's the flail, which is martial, and the war axe bludgeon. The flail, which is bludgeoning, and the war axe, which is slashing. So all three damage types are represented. The only one that stands out there is the Rapier, which is still a finesse weapon. There we go. Oh, and then I added into one-handed martial weapons the War Mallet. If you look at, say, Warhammer Fantasy Dwarves, they are very fond of very short hammers with a big heavy head in it. Looks like a mallet, but with a stone or metal head. Very similar to, say, Mjolnir from the Thor franchise. Short hammer, big heavy head. This is not a throwing weapon in most circumstances, so I'm not giving it the throwing property, but I have given it the heavy property. This is the only one-handed heavy weapon I've added, and it's a very dwarven thematic weapon. Just have this big, heavy, smashing hammer. Why is it useful? Because it's a one-handed weapon that does D10 damage. There you go. Only in bludgeoning. It's heavy, so smaller creatures can't use it without getting disadvantage. I thought it was thematic and fun. I threw it in there. Moving on to the versatile weapons, we have longsword, warhammer. With those already. The trident, I've updated the damage to, and it's still a thrown weapon. But I've added 2 more. Okay, I've added something I'm calling a flowsword. What is a flowsword? There is a Taiwanese performer called Titos Tsai, and he does this blade dance performance where he's got this beautiful sword, which is, it's sort of 40% handle, 60% blade. So it's got a very long handle, and the handle's got a big counterweight, and he is spinning it over his body and dancing with this sword, and it is absolutely beautiful. So I've added that weapon, I've called it the flowsword, as a versatile slashing finesse weapon. It's martial. So it's doing D8 or D10 damage, depending on whether you're using 1 or 2 hands. And it's a finesse weapon. So it's the biggest finesse weapon there is. And I'll put a link in the description to one of this guy's performances, because they are absolutely beautiful. And I think it's a cool weapon. I've also added something called a dory, which is someone who knows history is going to probably correct me on this. I believe that's the type of spear the ancient Greek hoplites used. So it's essentially a slightly bigger martial version of the spear. So it's got the versatile, it's got reach, it's still a thrown weapon, and it's piercing. So it does D6 or D8 damage, depending on whether you're using it with 1 or 2 hands. It's got reach, and it's a polearm for the purposes of polearm master, and you can throw it as well. So it's a martial version of a spear, basically. The trident I've mentioned fixed. Okay, we've got the halberd and glaive as our heavy reach polearm weapons. 2-handed. I've added a couple of extra things in there as well. I've added the poleaxe. The poleaxe was a weapon often used against cavalry, and it primarily featured sort of a heavy hammerhead on one side, and then either a spike or an axe blade on the other, and then a spike on the tip. So this is a weapon that's definitely going to get the martial property that lets you change between bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing. But as a default, it's a bludgeoning weapon, but other than that, it's identical to a halberd and glaive. So it's a polearm for the purposes of polearm master. It's 2-handed, it's heavy, and it's got reach. So it's a bludgeoning halberd or glaive, basically. I've also added a staff mace. So a staff mace is a slightly bigger version of something like a morning star or a warhammer. It's a versatile weapon, it's a reach weapon, it's a polearm, and it does bludgeoning. So it does D6 or D8. It's not a heavy weapon. It's not quite as chunky as the poleaxe, but it fills in a gap. Then we got pike. That's a normal heavy polearm reach, but it does not do as much damage. Let's see, no, it's D10 damage for a pike. Yep, that's good. Then we got the slashing and bludgeoning heavy weapons. We've got a great sword, great axe, and a maul. Isn't a piercing one. I'm trying to think of a sort of historical counterpart of a very big heavy spike, and there isn't really one. Maybe a pickaxe. Maybe I should add pickaxe as a weapon, because there is a war pick. So pickaxe would be a two-handed, heavy, piercing weapon. Yeah, okay, I'll do that now. So pickaxe. What I need to do is copy the various formula I've got. It is a martial weapon. It is a two-handed weapon. It is a heavy weapon, and it should be doing D12 damage. I'm going to make it 2d6, same as the greatsword. So there's a little bit of variation in there. Okay, but this is what I've been doing yesterday. So the task now is to assign the weapon masteries to the weapons. This is going to be a much bigger task. I've got 35 or 36 weapon masteries. Of those, about 30 need to be assigned. Some of them come from feats and therefore are usable on any appropriate weapon. But other than that, each weapon needs to have weapon masteries assigned to it. My aim is that simple weapons should have access to 3 or 4 weapon masteries, and martial weapons should have access to about 4 or 5 weapon masteries. And remember, the aim in a combo is to use 6 different weapon masteries in a turn. So if you're carrying 2 different martial weapons, one in each hand, you will have access, you'll have the potential to use quite a few. Remember, characters will start off with 4 weapon masteries, and every time they gain extra attack, they'll learn 2 more, and they might be able to learn more through various class features or feats. So it shouldn't be too difficult for a character to have 6 weapon masteries they can use, and then the fun part is, the gamey part is going, okay, these are the abilities I want to use, which weapons will allow me to use them, or these are the weapons I want to use, which feat should I learn so I can get the full spread of abilities. Now, assigning them is going to be a major and difficult task. That's going to take me a long time, so I'm probably not going to update this part of the project for a while. I have to ponder that and think what's going on. But it's a fun process. It involves me tinkering around with Dungeons and Dragons weapons and a spreadsheet. I'm in heaven with this. So that's an update for what I'm doing. If you've got any questions or any ideas, please do share. Are there any missing weapons in Dungeons and Dragons that you would like to be filled in? It's like, oh, I wish there was a weapon that had these properties, and here's a historical one that does that. Stick it in. Let me know, and I'll see if I can add it to the table. So, thanks for coming along for the video, and enjoy your next game, whatever it may be.